Okay, I'm going to take up where I left off for last week. With a little previewing of this slide here. We finally get up to Hitler. I'm going to analyze particularly his anti-Semitism, which obviously is very relevant to what we're talking about here. But before I do that, let me give some sense of his early background. He was born in a town in Austria. His father was a civil servant whose position changed literally every few months or at most every few years. In consequence, Hitler, by the time he was in his early teens, had already lived with a family in 5 or 6 towns, most of them in Austria, one for a couple of years in Germany. Finally settled in a town near Linz, a fairly substantial city. That is where Hitler lived during most of his teen years. In his memoir slash polemic, Mein Kampf, My Battle, which he dictated while he was in prison in 1925 for having attempted to lead a coup in 1923, Hitler discusses the early years, his years in Linz, and makes a reference to the Jews of Linz. He says, Jews in that town were Europeanized and human-looking. Indeed, I even took them for Germans. The nonsense of this conception was not clear to me because I saw just a single distinctive characteristic, the alien religion. However, we don't just have to take Hitler's word for it. We do have a man who met Hitler, became friends with him, when Hitler would have been about 18. Specifically, this man, August Kubitschek. The two were brought together by their love of Wagnerian music. He and Kubitschek, who would later live together briefly, I'll say a little bit about this in a couple of minutes, but would split up where basically Kubitschek would come back from a walk one day and find that Hitler had cleared all of his stuff out of their apartment and had gone elsewhere. They were sort of reconciled in the late 1930s, in which time Hitler was chancellor and really dictator. In 1953, after Hitler's death, Kubitschek would write a memoir. Mainly, he would discuss his friendship with Hitler under the title of The Young Hitler I Knew. And among Hitler's most important characteristics that he noted early and discusses in the book, in fact, he discusses at greater length than he discusses Hitler's anti-Semitism, was his extraordinary nationalism. It was not as an Austrian, it was always as a German. That was what Hitler identified. At one point early on in his book, Kubitschek says, with the same fanaticism with which he loved the German people, did he reject anything foreign? And this helps to explain his early anti-Semitism. Kubitschek accounts for Hitler's anti-Semitism through a set of early influences on him. He notes that his father was against Jews. In describing his school years, so here we're into Hitler's teens, Hitler omits to mention that some of the teachers of the technical school were openly anti-Semitic and made no bones about acknowledging their hatred of the Jews in the front of their pupils. And Hitler must certainly have been aware of the political aspects of the Jewish problem. It cannot have been otherwise. For when I met Adolf Hitler first in 1904, his anti-Semitism was already pronounced. And although his experiences in Vienna might have deepened this feeling, they certainly did not give birth to it. In fact, he mentions an early anecdote that he and Hitler were walking in Linz one day. They chanced on a synagogue, and Hitler pointed to it and said, "That shouldn't be." This is Hitler, the Hitler who could have been maybe 18. And as a matter of fact, Kubitschek says here, by the time they met first, Hitler was already a confirmed anti-Semite. And it is interesting that he should do this because in Mein Kampf, Hitler suggests that he became an anti-Semite only when he was in his early 20s and was at that time in Vienna. He had gone there in 1907, had brought Kubitschek along. They did work together for a while, then Hitler walked out on. But Hitler basically says at the time that he went to Vienna, was not an anti-Semite. He may have thought the Jews were strange, but he didn't hate them. Hitler claims that a particular experience he had in Vienna in 1909 first raised anti-Semitism within him. He's giving a very different timeline than Kubitschek does. And actually, although it may not be obvious here, basically, Kubitschek is arguing against the timeline that Hitler provides in Mein Kampf. And indeed, we can be sure that Kubitschek was very familiar with Mein Kampf and what Hitler had claimed. Okay, so what did Hitler claim? He claimed that in early 1909, he entered a period of spiritual and mental turmoil. He was impoverished. What had happened was that these two teenagers, he and Kubitschek, went to Vienna hoping to make it in, set themselves up for careers in art. Hitler aspired to become a painter. He wanted to get into the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And he suggested to Kubitschek that maybe, since he was a fine musician, he could get into a music conservatory in Vienna as well. And Kubitschek did. In fact, he went on to become a fairly celebrated orchestra conductor, so he had a good career in this. But Hitler was twice turned down when he attempted to get into the Academy of Fine Arts, which hurt him very much. So to get back to this conversion to anti-Semitism that he refers to in Mein Kampf, he says that one day in 1909, he saw a Jew in Vienna. And it was, he tells us, not like anything he'd ever seen. He was used to Jews who were assimilated, dressed like the culture they were in, all basically didn't look different from other people. That day he saw, quote, and this is a quotation from Mein Kampf, an apparition in a long caftan with black locks. Well, certainly a Hasidic Jew. Is this a Jew, was my first thought. The longer I stared at this alien face, the more my first question was transformed into a new conception. Is this a German? Remember, according to Kubitschek, he is a fanatical German nationalist. So this is a very important question to him. And he decides that no, not only was this Jew definitely not a German, but that Jews as a people were not Germans. And he was a fanatical German, as Kubitschek tells us, and as we have so much evidence of. Then Hitler thought he wanted to learn more about the Jews. He started to read books about them. At newsstands, one could find a number of books espousing various anti-Semitic ideals on this theme. He tells us that he read very widely, that he, among other persons, he read Voltaire, who, as I mentioned, often dealt with anti-Semitic themes in his writing. Hitler read Wagner, given his love of Wagnerian music. This isn't that surprising. And I've already discussed Wagner's hostility toward the Jews, but particularly seems to have liked and admired by this man who was born in England, the major and successful family. But at an early age, he developed a real love of German culture and emigrated, settled in Germany. Eventually, he would marry Wagner's daughter. Hitler would later describe him as the prophet of the Third Reich. Nazi Germany. Chamberlain wrote many works, but far and away his best known is entitled The Foundations of the 19th Century. It was published in 1999. And in it, he put forward basically a premise that was heavily anti-Semitic, heavily racialist. Basically, to him, history, as it had been to Gobineau, was just a study of races in conflict, including the Jews or Semites very much as a race who automatically, thereby, were hostile to other races, just as all races were hostile to others. And Chamberlain did say that all European races could be regarded as somewhat Aryan. They were all Aryan, but some were much purer as races than were others. And the most pure were the Germans, the Teutons, and the Nordic people, including the Scandinavians. They were pure Aryans. The only other pure race in the world was the Semites, by which he meant the Jews. And he says basically the Jews have destroyed countless civilizations. They brought them down, they brought them down, they brought them down by blood mixing. They had, along the way, destroyed Chinese civilization, and they'd had a worldwide impact, destruction. Ultimately, it was basically Jews against Germany. That was it. And that was the climactic battle for civilization. And Hitler read this and he really, really liked it. We can see that reflected in his adoration of Wimbledon. Hitler also seems to have developed a taste for the occult, for finding hidden truths, conspiracies, that the world that we see is not the real world. That's much deeper. We must look more into it and use methods that are unconventional, not standard science, but occult science. They were also very much into mythology and the myths of different peoples. There was one group that is particularly notable, perhaps most obviously. This is the symbol of the Thule Society. You can see it has a swastika, and this would be carried over to the Nazi Party. As a matter of fact, Hitler would later design the emblem for the Nazi Party, and he based it on this symbol. Okay, the Thule Society drew its name from a mythical island or country way up north called Thule. And during their fairly brief existence, it was only about 7 years, of the Thule Society, it had these meetings that was devoted to occult interpretations of things, not looking for what was obvious, what was in the newspapers, that sort of thing, but behind the curtains, this hidden world that they imagined. They also had their political side, and that would grow into the establishment of the German Workers' Party. And then, at Hitler's insistence, a couple of years later, when he was the leader of the group, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, that's where it got its start, back in association with the Thule Society. Anyway, there were many occultists active in Austria and in Germany. Background, especially for 20 years or so, 20th century. Among them was this man, Georg Lanz von Liebenfels, an Austrian who was for a time a Catholic monk, but eventually left his order, started to teach and preach a very mystical faith, but also relevant to our place story here or storyline. The world as he saw it once again involved a fight to the death between essentially the last two races, the Germans and the Jews. And like many of them, he saw the Jews as being on the brink of victory. So the Germans had to fight back. And they had to ready wage race fight until the castration night. Basically, let the Jews until they succeed in emasculating Germany. Is quite certain that Hitler knew about von Liebenfeld's ideas. We'll see some evidence of that in a minute. Von Liebenfels, who published his views a great deal, claimed that Hitler had, back in 1909, had come to the place where von Liebenfels was staying and had told him that he didn't have certain issues of a magazine that von Liebenfels had published, and he asked him for copies, and von Liebenfels gave them to him. Historians debate just how accurate this is, but in any case, Hitler certainly knew of him and his ideas, always aware of other occultists who were arguing pretty much the same thing about this race war coming up. What I'm going to do now for the next few slides is to discuss and to illustrate the centrality of the Jew in Hitler's thinking. It was a preoccupation. I've mentioned before that it was the most dangerous time for Jews was when they were in the strongest spotlight, when there was a real focus on them. In Hitler's mind, they were the focus. But when did he develop this real obsession, the Jews? When did he even start to think about the desirability of destroying the Jews? Here I would suggest that most historians would say it was probably as a result of his service in World War. He served for 6 years in the army and made sure it was the German army. He was afraid that if he stayed in Vienna, he was going to be drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army. He didn't want that. He wanted to be in a German army and took pains to, he moved into Germany, moved to Munich in 1913, so that if he was drafted, he would at least be drafted into the German army. As it was, he didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted. But then, of course, the army is defeated. And the government is forced to sign a very humiliating treaty and to admit that they were guilty of causing the war, which German nationalists didn't like. They were forced to pay extraordinarily heavy reparations because they caused the war. And Hitler was far from the only one, but he was among those who saw the real cause of the war as having been the Jews, and the real reason for the defeat of the Germans in the Jews. So it was really toward the end of his service that his anti-Semitism starts to really spike and becomes more dangerous. Okay, let's give a few quotations illustrating his preoccupation with the Jews. And I'm going to draw these mainly from two sources. One, a set of speeches that he gave, mostly from 1920 to 1925, and a bit from Mein Kampf. Okay, first from his speeches. Greatest danger is and remains the alien poison in our body. All other dangers are transitory. Now, he could have taken maybe the more politically admired position. Really, France was the great enemy in the eyes of most Germans. So why didn't he say the French? No, he didn't. They're the alien poison. He's thinking about the Jews. Another case, the Jew has never founded any civilization, though he has destroyed hundreds. Seeds of Tacitus. And that quotation I gave you from Tacitus way, way, way back. And then, in racialism. And this, by the way, is from Mein Kampf. He, meaning the Jew, of course, poisons the blood of others, but preserves his own. It's how it can be that Jews are destroying all these civilizations by blood mixing and blood abasement while not suffering themselves. They have this mystical power. But with Hitler, we see early on this absolute belief in the international Jewish conspiracy and the imminence of the Jewish takeover. So here we have these lines from Mein Kampf. In keeping with the ultimate aims of the Jewish struggle, which are not exhausted in the mere economic conquest of the world, but also demand its political subjugation, he stops at nothing. And in his vileness, he becomes so gigantic that no one need be surprised if among our people, the personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew. So we even have the old idea of this close association between the Jews and the devil. Okay? And now I'm going to move up a bit to January 1939 and a speech to the Parliament, to the Reichstag. He's already written widely, and most nationalists believe that the First World War was caused by the Jews. If international financed Jewry in and outside Europe succeeds in plunging the peoples into another world war, then the end result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and the consequent victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Now, the reason why this passage is so often quoted by historians is he is really anticipating the Holocaust, because he's saying this. And finally, I'm going to quote from a document usually called Hitler's Political Testament. We're now another 6 years further on. We're at the end of the day before he committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. Hitler dictated his political testament, and this is what he wrote. It is untrue that I wanted the war in 1939. It was desired and instigated solely by those international statesmen who were either of Jewish descent or worked for Jewish interests. Centuries will pass away, but out of the ruins of our towns and monuments, hatred will grow against those finally responsible for everything, international Jewry and its helpers. But there is this preoccupation, and we see it constantly in Hitler's speeches and his writings, implicitly in the international Jewish conspiracy. and certainty that there is going to be a climactic battle very soon, that the odds are stacked against the Germans and other Europeans. So the Jews are probably going to take over, but one must fight against that. Okay. Now, solving the Jewish problem, what did he recommend to take care of Jews? First one should sound familiar to you. Fight to the knife against Jewry. Obviously, is a pretty close paraphrase of Liebenfeld's. The Jew's skull will be smashed by Germanic will. Short work must be made of Jewry. We are actuated by the inexorable resolve to grasp the evil by the roots and eradicate it to the core. Now, an excerpt from Mein Kampf. Had 12 or 15,000 Hebraic nation spoilers been put under poison gas at the start of the war, the million-fold sacrifice at the front would not have been in vain. And obviously, he's referring to killing Jews with poison gas, and that would be the fate for several million of them during the Holocaust. Then I'll close out this slide with a final quotation, and this is from a speech he gave in 1922. If I am ever really in power, the annihilation of the Jews will be my first and foremost task. There has been ongoing debate among Holocaust historians where they're divided into two sides of an issue. There are the functionalists and there are the intentionalists. Basically, the intentionalists believe that what Hitler was saying about his plans for the Jews show that, yeah, he was literally thinking in terms of exterminating, if he ever had the power to do so. He wasn't saying it because he thought it would appeal to the crowd, that it was politically wise to say this. But then there are the functionalists. As we'll see, the war breaks out in September 1939. But the Holocaust, this drive to exterminate the Jews, is really more the product of the summer of 1941. So why was there this delay? The functionalists are people who believe that the sudden move toward extermination is a function of the Second World War and the fact that all of a sudden Germany is expanding into areas that have a much higher Jewish population than it has, well, notably Poland. But even beyond this, that the Germans don't want to commit themselves to a venture as huge as exterminating all the Jews when they have a multi-front war to fight. What starts to happen, though, is in the early years of the war, Germany is always on the advance. It's advancing in Western Europe, it's advancing in Eastern Europe. And so after the invasion of the USSR in the summer of 1941, they decide now's the time to move ahead with the destruction of the Jews. Okay, so we have the intentionalists, we have the functionalists, and we have, this is Albert Speer, the youngest man in Hitler's circle. Speer was an architect. Hitler liked his architecture. During the war, he was the Minister of Industry and War Production. I thought I'd read you a couple of quotations from Speer's writing while he was in prison at Spandau. Little will I get over having served in a leading position in a regime whose real energies were dedicated to the extermination of human beings. And then this quotation. For him who cared to hear, Hitler had never concealed even his intention to exterminate the Jewish people. And mind you, this is coming from someone who had been very close to him for a long time, inner circle. This would seem to favor the intentionalist position. I will say probably a majority of historians, major historians at least, tend toward the functionalist position because it explains why things changed so dramatically in 1941. Holocaust deniers say a lot of things, but they're so transparently false. I mean, there are those who would deny that there was a Holocaust at all, who would deny there was a final solution. I'll be quoting some things later on that I think should take care of this. Now, historians have not been able to locate a written order signed by Hitler that calls for simply moving ahead with the extermination of the Jews. Whether we will ever find that, who knows? Whether it exists, well, but even if there is no such order, Hitler gave permission. It would have been impossible for him to have not known that the Holocaust was going on. It would have ruined the careers of too many high-ranking Nazis who had known and were engineering it. If Hitler said, well, people haven't told me anything about this, that would have been inconceivable. No, there is just no way that the final solution could have proceeded without Hitler's approval, and it undoubtedly goes way beyond approval. That this was what he wanted, this was what he was demanding. Now that there were other engineers as well, that's fair to say, and I'll be talking about that in a little while. Antisemitism and the Nazi Party. By early 1921, Hitler was in control of the party, and ever more so as it went along. And he was also in control of a reliable base, and Hitler was always extremely proud of himself as a speaker, one who could carry his audience. And in Mein Kampf, he writes, in the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility. So he's using the term big lie. Goebbels would later use it a lot. I mean, basically, Hitler's philosophy of winning crowds was to repeat the message again and again and again, speaking in one's face. And eventually, even the doubters would be brought over because it would be coming at them so passionately put by someone that they had respect for that they would ultimately follow along. So he could get away with anything. Hitler, by the way, gives many indications of not having had much respect for his crowd. I mean, he liked having individuals and audiences fawning over him, but that doesn't mean that he really respected them intellectually. Okay, I'm going to move now. Early Nazi policy on the Jews, 1933 to 1939. First, boycott and exclusion. The usual date the historians would give for when Hitler gained power is when he became chancellor, appointed by the president of the Weimar Republic, General von Hindenburg, World War I hero. He had run through a series of chancellors. This was a very unstable political situation. And he was receiving a lot of advice that Hitler was safe and that he had this big base of support, but that he himself was a lot less radical than he liked to sound. That he would be a safe appointment as chancellor. And when Hindenburg gave in, Hitler was installed as chancellor on January 30th, 1933. That's a big date. But in a sense, the really big dates came after that. February 27th, you have the Reichstag fire. An arsonist burns down much of the Reichstag building. Hitler immediately claims that the communists had done it. The communists were the second biggest party after the Nazis, as measured in those elections in 1932. A young Dutchman lived in Germany and was a communist, pretty active one, an ardent one, did confess to having been the one who torched the Reichstag. Not only was he charged with the crime, but so were several men who were accused of being accessories. In the end, they weren't sent to prison, but he was executed. But what's ultimately important for this is that, first of all, Hitler gets von Hindenburg to cancel lots of civil rights, basically seeing this as an attempted coup. Then Hitler builds on that. So you have Hitler's installation at the end of January 1933, the Reichstag fire at the end of February 1933, and then in March 1933 you have the Enabling Act, which comes in through von Hindenburg's order and basically gives the head of the ministry power, the right to rule by decree. His proclamations have the force of law, and that is basically Hitler. There were others who technically were included in terms of the ministry, but no, it's basically hidden. This is the so-called Enabling Act. Hitler is now free to rule by decree, so we can say now the dictatorship starts. And it is exacerbated when, end of June, early July, other parties are banned. So it's just the Nazis. And, these months, something really big is happening. Every month, no longer needs a coalition partner. It's now just the Nazis, pretty much top to bottom. So, April 1933, the Nazis launch a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses of all kinds. At the same time, Jews are being forced out of many occupations, many careers. Teachers, they're all forced out. Civil servants who have even one Jewish grandparent, whether they associate with the Jewish community at all or identify with it at all, they are dismissed. The government is being transformed. You already have need for a whole lot of new civil servants who will observe new policies. And then there are the laws who are enacted by the Reichstag, which, by the way, for the time being, in fact, for a long time, is not meeting in the Reichstag building. There are 11 laws, 11 statutes targeting the Jews and limiting them in one way or another in April 1933. You see, this is all coming very quickly. And to anti-Semites was wonderful. Here was a politician who was actually keeping his promises. You know, he talked about doing these really bad things to the Jews, and he's doing them and is setting them as a high priority. During the early years of the Nazi regime, 1933, 1939, there are nearly 200 laws that are passed by the Reichstag that target the Jews. Sometimes they target other people too, other groups too, but target the Jews. Almost 200 of them. And as the group, they greatly diminish the rights of Jews. They limit, in many respects, their rights to decent paying jobs. They are hard on the Jews. Most famous by far is a set of 3 laws called the Nuremberg laws, because they were passed at a meeting of the Reichstag that took place in a hall in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg laws, they do 3 very important things. First, they give legal definition to Jew, who is a Jew, and they do it racially in terms of his or her heredity. Anyone with 3 Jewish grandparents, or 2, if this person associated with the Jewish community was classified as a Jew. This law also created 2 categories of Mischlinge, meaning mixed breeds. A Mischling of the first degree had 2 Jewish grandparents but was not involved with the Jewish community, while a Mischling second degree had 1 Jewish grandparent. The vast majority of Mischlinge of either category had been raised Christian, but both groups were persecuted, as obviously were the Jews. And many of those in the first degree perished in the Holocaust, were sent to the camps and did die there. The second Nuremberg law bars Jews from marrying Aryans or having sexual relations with them, and stipulates that any child conceived of such unions after the law takes effect will be considered Jewish. The final Nuremberg law, also known as the citizenship law, denies Jews citizenship. They basically denies them German citizenship and any of the rights associated with citizenship. And even here, but this isn't the end of it with the Nuremberg laws, keeps going on and on and on. And I talked about the fact that there were nearly 200 specifically anti-Semitic laws passed during the period 1933 to 39, and this is only what the Reichstag is passing. There are also state legislatures which are passing their own anti-Semitic laws. Hitler had a number of groups in his base that he tried to appeal to, focused particularly on. Earlier, I talked about the farmers. A country that, even though by this time was majority urban, still clung to the idea of water and soil And that was what defined the nation. The German nation was rural, was tied to the soil. There were still those who regarded the city and the city populations as being parasitic. The Nazis went after the farmers, especially the small farmers. That was part of their base, and they were quite successful there. But there was no group that Hitler more persistently pursued than young people. This photo taken in 1930, so of course before he was chancellor, shows him, and I don't think it's unfair to say an adoring crowd and overwhelmingly male. This was part of it, part of something bigger, part of indoctrination. And remember, after a short time, there were no Jewish teachers. There were lots and lots of very anti-Jewish teachers. But in any case, they were locked into a curriculum that preached anti-Semitism. The Jews were looked on just in terms of their harm to Germany. Icons like Luther were cited constantly. But then there were a whole lot of things that children were taught to believe in and not to believe in. The importance of nation, and not just Germany. People were supposed to intensely identify with a nation. Hitler couldn't stand, and any other nationalist couldn't stand the Jews, as well the Roma or Gypsies, because they were not identified with a particular nation. They wanted everyone to be a nation. It could be a better nation or a worse nation, but at any rate, they intensely believed in nationalism, including, of course, German nationalism in Hitler's case. That's what teachers were supposed to preach. That's what the school books were supposed to teach, and there have been lots of books written analyzing the syllabi German schools of this period. They preached militarism, they glorified, hated pacifism. They hated the idea of people saying we're all alike, we're all brothers and sisters. No, no, no. The children were supposed to learn that different nations were very different from each other, and that those who were from a different people but living within a certain nation were dangerous. Someone like Einstein, who described himself as being an internationalist as well as a pacifist, was very important on both fronts and had many admirers for these positions. He was a very political guy. To the Nazis, well, he was just showing that his views were dangerous and that Jewish people were dangerous if they had similar views, which they were believed to have. Glorification of the state, glorification of Hitler. That was also very much in the curriculum. Children's books that preached these same lines. The Hitler Youth, or Aryan teenagers, preached these same values: militarism, loyalty to the state, loyalty to the nation, Jews as a danger. And then, outside of it, the girls' equivalent of the Hitler Youth was the League of German Girls, and here they are at some sort of rally, all waving their pennants with swastikas on them. Historians often, despite this indoctrination, historians have something of a debate going about really whether it was necessary to achieve Hitler's aims. I've been suggesting that anti-Semitism was very common, very virulent in Germany before Hitler came to power. It had been skyrocketing, certainly since the end of World War I and Germany's defeat. Very few Germans had even heard of it. So how important was Hitler to the mix of anti-Semitism? How important was this new curriculum in the schools and in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls? In 1996, a young political scientist at Harvard named Daniel Jonah Goldhagen published what immediately became a huge bestseller, Hitler's Willing Executioners, where he argues that whereas anti-Semitism was to be found all around Europe, it had a particularly potent variation in Germany. That German anti-Semitism was even more virulent, more dangerous than the rest, because the Germans favored eliminationist anti-Semitism. That was their brand, that they wanted to be rid of the Jews. Now, this could, of course, come from banishing them, forcing them out, but it could also come from exterminating. And that at any rate, the idea of exterminating the Jews was not something that necessarily shocked the Germans. Very lengthy introductory chapter goes back into the late 19th century and slowly into the 20th and talks about the publications of extreme writings that basically are eliminationist in nature, including genocidal. That is the way the Jewish problem should be addressed. And that this eliminationist anti-Semitism made the Germans willing executioners of the Holocaust. Now, I must say that many very important Holocaust historians feel that Goldhagen outran his evidence considerably. But the debate goes on. I would say that. And certainly when one talks about genocides in general, there is this question about people were quite willing to be involved. Already by the close of 1933, the Jews were largely forced back on themselves and their own resources and their own organization, just to keep things going socially, have their own schools. In September 1933, the government established the Representative Council of Jews in Germany. As someone pointed out, that it doesn't say German Jews, because that would imply that they were possibly good Germans and it was just they had a different religion. No, Jews in Germany. President, he was the head of the group. Which is Leo Bike. He was a leader of Reform Judaism, which really got its start in Germany. He was easily the best known rabbi in Berlin. He would have huge impact over a lot of years. There's still the Leo Bike Institute. September 1933, the government orders the creation of this Representative Council of Jews. They do a lot of organizing for the benefit of the Jewish community. As I say, they open their own schools. They provide help to poor Jews and Jews losing their businesses and that sort of thing. But very notably, they also strongly recommend that Jews get out of Germany. I mean, almost from day one, they're recommending that, which brings up the issue of immigration. So is Beich's request working? Well, we find out that in its early years, the Nazi regime was encouraging immigration of German Jews, early encouragement toward the British Mandate of Palestine. There were other places that were looked at as possibilities. And Jews could settle there as long as they weren't in Germany anymore. Issues affecting departure. There were many German Jews who didn't want to or didn't have the opportunity of emigrating. During the period 1933 to 39, policy on immigration is handled particularly by the Minister of Economic Affairs, Hjalmar Schacht, the man on the left here. And he says that immigration of Jews is, among other things, very profitable to Germany. Therefore, it should be simply encouraged, made as profitable as it could be, that it would be beneficial to the state. One had to pay a hefty fee to the German government to get out. Okay, so not everyone could afford that. Well, there were also sentimental reasons. Plenty of Jews just, they consider themselves Germans. And they thought that, well, Hitler's not going to be around forever, and we'll get back to earlier times, and it won't be that bad. Well, anyway, they didn't want to leave Germany. But others, as I say, couldn't afford to go, literally. Schacht pointed out that Jews who emigrated would lose a quarter of their wealth through the fee that the German government forced them to pay. According to him, also, they would lose another quarter of their wealth if they were business owners, because they'd have to sell the businesses, they would have to sell their homes at a time when those who are buying them would know that they could get a tremendous deal since the Jews had to get out. Of the remainder, Jews would lose about 90% because of negative rates as they exchanged their currency. So basically, they would be driven, if not into abject poverty, close to it. This was something that was wrecking the Jewish economy. And in late 1938, he came up with a plan to end legal Jewish immigration, except for Jews who had been granted particular opportunity to immigrate, because he thought that then Germany would have tremendous leverage. It could demand that foreign governments pay for Jews to get out and greatly raise the fees associated with that. The organizations abroad would pay, especially Jewish organizations would pay to get them out, make it more profitable. The story goes that he actually got into a loud argument with Hitler because of this plan, which would take a couple of years to get in force. And Hitler was growing impatient over lack of a world war. And it wasn't a good idea to argue with Hitler. So Schacht spent a war concentration camp. I'd like to give you an example of what could, if we met with someone who is philanthropic about it and has lots of means. And so I introduced this guy on the right, whose name is Carl Lemley. He was born in Germany, was a young man, immigrated to the United States, had some early successes back east, but then he moved out to California and became a movie mogul. He established Universal Studios. He won one of the earliest Oscars. All went to him in 1930 because he had produced All Quiet on the Western Front, which is an anti-war movie set in World War I. But he's also famous for having been the first to produce movies on Dracula and Frankenstein. He had lots of big hits, made lots of money, and became a philanthropist. Well, one thing that he did was to buy the way out for German Jews who literally couldn't afford to leave, and particularly those from state in Western Germany that he was born in. Who managed to bring hundreds of them out, paying the fees at the Germans' end, paying their entry fees to get them into the United States, finding jobs for them, often having to do with Hollywood. Yeah, there were some people like this. Will I give an example? Okay, I'm going to wind up this part of the lecture with this slide showing, first of all, there would be those who would say, why didn't the Jews get out of Germany? Actually, they did. Between 1933 and 1939, the German Jewish population dropped more than 2/3, from about 503,000 in the spring of 1833 when this was coming to power to 163,000 by November 1941, which is the month when further immigration by anyone out of Germany was banned. So where did the Jews who left go? The prime choice was the U.S. You can see about 90,000 German Jews went there. Palestine, very popular, about 60,000 go there. If you look at these maps, you can see where they were going. They were going as far away as Singapore, where they helped to build that famous ghetto during the war. A lot of them were going to South America, but a lot of them were going. That's the big thing. However, many didn't go far enough. They went just west of Germany into the Low Countries, into France. And when Germany invaded in 1941, in control, they would be in danger. That's what happened to the Frank family. And yes, they left Germany, but all they did, Leo Frank and the family, was move to Amsterdam. And that was not far enough for them to be safe. Once Germany started expanding. Okay, I'm going to wind up for today. We'll be going on with this next Sunday, and we'll be moving toward World War II and the start of the Holocaust.